international rules-based order is something that the West has really promulgated. It loves this notion of the international rules-based order, which allowed it to invade Iraq, but did not allow Russia to invade Ukraine. And we've seen this time and time again where it said, okay, we could, Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in 1990 was wrong, but us invading Panama the year before was completely fine.
Absolutely, both things that you said, and this isn't the first time that India has done this. If we sort of circle back to August 2019, when India abrogated Article 370 and 35A of its constitution and revoked Kashmir's special status, in doing so, they violated UN resolutions that mandate a plebiscite in Indian-occupied Kashmir, and in both regions agreed to a plebiscite, a free and impartial plebiscite, and this had both a moral premise as well as a legal premise, that it is for the people of Kashmir to decide their future and they have the right to self-determination. I'm Rida Hosain, and in today's Case in Point, we're going to talk about recent events that have threatened the international rules-based order, an order on which there was largely a consensus post the Second World War. Especially post-October 2023, there have been a lot of questions about whether international law is still relevant or whether international law is effectively defunct due to its failure to prevent Israel's genocide and ongoing carnage in Gaza. Recently, after various attacks in Pahalgam, India attempted to attribute blame to Pakistan and took various steps which, at least in my view, are not consistent with India's international law obligations. To talk about all of this, as well as the future of the international rules-based order, we have with us Ayesha Malik. Ayesha is the Deputy Director of the Research Society of International Law, and she is also the team lead at the Conflict Law Center. Thank you, Ayesha, so much for joining us. Very recently, after the attacks in Pahalgam, mere hours after the attack, India pointed the finger across the border and basically to Pakistan. There was no investigation, there was no inquiry, there was no evidence, and there couldn't have been any evidence after such a short time period, and we saw that the finger was pointed to Pakistan. And thereafter, not only did they attribute blame without any evidence, they also attempted to impose punishment by saying that they are holding the Indus Water Treaty in abeyance, even though the Indus Water Treaty has no such clause, does not allow for suspension. And so they attributed blame and they attempted to impose punishment. And thereafter, various Indian politicians, BJP ministers adopted warmongering rhetoric against Pakistan and made various irresponsible statements. And one such statement by a BJP minister was that Pakistan will be torn up into 4 parts. And so we've seen this kind of an irresponsible rhetoric, and no responsible state, in my view, would attribute blame without evidence and also take action without evidence. So the message that we're getting currently is that India is not interested in following international law, is not interested in following international norms, and even the Vienna Convention imposes an obligation on states to perform treaties in good faith, and this is not good faith performance. So how do you view India's recent actions, and especially in the context of the recent threats generally to the rules-based order?
So just to zoom out a little bit before we go in, I'm going to be very annoying and kind of pick apart the question. So the international rules-based order is something that the West has really promulgated. It loves this notion of the international rules-based order, which allowed it to invade Iraq, but did not allow Russia to invade Ukraine. And we've seen this time and time again where it said, okay, we could, Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in 1990 was wrong, but us invading Panama the year before was completely fine. And so the entire precipice upon which rules-based order rests is this notion of selective condemnation on the basis of international law. So international lawyers are now trying to move away from that term, and I think largely because of what we've seen in Gaza especially, it's away from this notion of selective condemnation. So let's rely on actual international law rather than this notion of the rules-based order that you have invented against people that you're opposed to and in favor of people who are your allies. So when it comes down to international law and focusing now on India's actions and what it's doing, India is actually appealing to international law and what it's doing. And so it is using the language of international law to kind of give this legal cover. And we might argue that it's lip service or whether it's actually, something that it is largely going to build a case upon. The notion of this cross-border terrorism that it fictitiously says is attributable to Pakistan without, as you said, giving any shred of evidence. There are tests for attribution in international law, which are, for the purposes of self-defense. Currently, we're at the precipice of what looks to be a military operation by India. And so the test that they would have to satisfy for the use of self-defense against an attack that it could attribute to Pakistan, of it being that we had conducted the Pahalgam attack, is that we had actually sent those people to go and conduct the attack. We have seen not a shred of evidence from India in which you can make that link with Pakistan. And yet at the same time, you are seeing that they are appealing to the law of treaties to say that there has been a fundamental change of circumstance. Obviously, there has not been a fundamental change of circumstance. We had the Indus Waters Treaty. We had that negotiated over a period of a decade, after which the two countries had already been at war twice by that point. So the notion that this is something completely unforeseen and that was not really baked into the fundamental negotiations of the treaty is something which is quite ridiculous. But they're also appealing to the notion of the law of state responsibility, right? Where they're saying that you've committed this internationally wrongful act. And so now what we're going to do is hold this treaty in suspension, in abeyance, which is not part of the treaty and it can't do. But really what I see is completely different. I see a complete resting of this case and the building of a case if we see a military operation on the foundational principles of international law. It is a completely bogus case. I think that these are imaginations that India is going through in terms of trying to make that link and in terms of what it's doing to a treaty which does not have that provision included.
Absolutely, both things that you've said. And this isn't the first time that India has done this. If we sort of circle back to August 2019, when India abrogated Article 370 and 35A of its constitution and revoked Kashmir's special status, in doing so, they violated UN resolutions that mandate a plebiscite in Indian occupied Kashmir, and in both regions agreed to a plebiscite, a free and impartial plebiscite. And this had both a moral premise as well as a legal premise, that it is for the people of Kashmir to decide their future and they have the right to self-determination. And we saw India unilaterally revoke those articles and revoke the special status, and in doing so violate those UN resolutions, and again it suffered no consequences. And in the same year they passed the Citizenship Amendment Act, which granted certain classes of refugees access to citizenship but denied Muslims the right to citizenship under that law. So they linked the citizenship to religion. And the reason I mention this is that because Article 35A, now that it's revoked, it means that Hindu settlers and Indians can now go into Indian occupied Kashmir and have access to land over there and have authority to buy land. So India is also attempting to, or has attempted to, alter the Muslim majority demographic in Kashmir by its actions. And even this is prohibited under the Geneva Convention. An occupying territory, which is India, cannot transplant its own population into an occupied territory, which is what we've seen them doing. And they've also issued domicile certificates to several thousands of their citizens who are now in Indian occupied Kashmir. So we've seen a pattern of behavior on part of India where it does not comply with international obligations. And even on a bilateral level, we've seen India misuse the Shimla Agreement. They invoke it and they insist on bilateralism when it suits them. And in other matters, they will say that, international resolution and try for international resolution. And in terms of Pakistan saying that, we will hold the Shimla Agreement in abeyance if India continues on the current path that it's on, at least to me, that signifies Pakistan now saying that you cannot insist on this one-sided performance of the Shimla Agreement, because at its heart, it was about peaceful coexistence. And it was about the fact that you can't unilaterally change the status, which is what they've done. So it's Pakistan saying that you can't hold us hostage to bilateralism while you breach all international law. So how do you look at it in that context?
Yeah, so I think that the Shimla Agreement is something which India, by its actions on August 5th, 2019, has completely violated. So we've had a major breach of that treaty by India in the fact that it unilaterally changed the situation, which it promised that it wouldn't do. And I think that going forward from 1971 and up until now, for a long time, India has not interacted with UNMOGIP, which is the UN mission, observer, which is the UN mission, which is the observer group for India Pakistan, which looks at Kashmir and looks at LOC ceasefire violations. So Pakistan has continued to interact with UNMOGIP, and yet they're not allowed on the Indian side of the border. And India really enjoys the notion that it has managed to bilateralize this dispute. After 2019, we didn't see much happening. We saw a closed-door security meeting called by China, a Security Council meeting called by China. But beyond that, we didn't really see much. Most of the international community were like, okay, you guys just try and figure this out if you can. There's not the interest in the Kashmir dispute that we see in the Palestine dispute. And I think that that's largely something Pakistan has really tried to push that. The pivot that we've done to geoeconomics to try and like shelve the Kashmir issue until we figure out other things, I think may now have been a mistake in the sense of that the Shimla agreement for me has been laid dead and for a while, given the breach by India. The issue with Pakistan completely walking away from that agreement is the LOC ceasefire line, which it kind of demarcates, in which we would have to go back to 1949. Now, if we're going to have that standing, or if we're going to have that agreement go, what do we go back to? But the success that India has had in bilateralizing this dispute is something that I think that Shimla wasn't meant to do, but they have pushed this notion that it does that. And I think that that is somewhere where we need to internationalize this dispute. It is two of the oldest disputes on the UN books in terms of the peacekeeping operations with Kashmir and Palestine. And I find that both of these conflicts are incredibly, inextricably linked together. And we should have both of them internationalized.
And you talked about Palestine as well, and we started with talking about whether international law is still relevant or not. And a lot of the concerns that have been raised by people regarding the relevance of international law has been post October 2023, that now you have a death toll of over 50,000 people. Israel has bombed hospitals, they've killed women, children, stopped healthcare workers, aid workers from entering. They've used starvation as a method of punishment, imposed collective punishment. And you've had the ICJ and the ICC giving a series of rulings. You had the ICJ saying that Israel's occupation and continued presence is unlawful. South Africa made a case, and provisional measures were granted, binding provisional measures were granted. And I quote that at least some of the rights asserted by South Africa under the Genocide Convention are plausible, is what the ICJ held. And then one judge also, Justice Yusuf, said that all the indicators of genocidal activities are flashing red in Gaza. And you have this acknowledgement by judges in the ICJ. There are arrest warrants for Netanyahu by the ICC, but at a practical level, we don't see any consequences for Israel. And this is partly because A, because of the enforcement mechanism, and B, because of the Western support and largely the support of the United States of America for Israel. And they are funding, arming, supporting this genocide. So when you have this complete failure of international law and the example that is in front of us, what is really the future, and why should people have faith in that system?
Yeah, so I mean, this is my area of law. I'm a war lawyer, so I look at the laws of war and I look at the law relating to the use of force. And a lot of people have come to me over the last, it's been nearly 2 years that we've witnessed a genocide, which, unlike previous genocides, has been live streamed to our phones, asking what is the point in international law if we can't commit to this being something that we never do again, especially because contemporary international law came out after the horrors of the Holocaust in World War II. Now, I always reply with the Louis Henkin quote, which is that almost all nations follow almost all of their international legal obligations almost all of the time. And that is the bit that you see, that is not seen, right? Where international is actually working. But where it doesn't work and where it fails on such a spectacular level, like we see in Gaza, those are things that we can't get behind and can't get past. Of course, international law itself, the rules of war themselves, as they were drafted after World War II and after the Vietnam War, they're not perfect, but they're a really, really good start. And the fact that we don't have an enforcement mechanism is one of the key weaknesses. And for me, it's not even the lack of an enforcement mechanism, it's that you have one, but it's paralyzed by the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. We're living in a very different world now compared to we were living in 1945. That P5, either it has to be enlarged or it has to completely go, and all of that power should go to the General Assembly. But one of the things I will say in defense of international, and especially as we're here on the precipice of another military intervention by India, perhaps, is to look at the areas where states do comply with international law. And that is the laws of war, largely because they hinge on the notion of reciprocity, right? And we can look back at 2019 at what happened in our own country, where we had the prisoner of war Abhinandan on our territory, and we treated him in line with the Third Geneva Convention. And so the minute he fell into enemy hands, the entirety of the obligations of the Third Geneva Convention applied to him. And why do states uphold those obligations so willingly and in such a resolute way? It's because the notion is that my servicemen might tomorrow be on your territory and fall into enemy hands over there, and I want them to be given the same protections that I would. So while we made videos of him which were incorrect and against the laws of war, by and large, we treated him in accordance with the Third Geneva Convention. And the Third Geneva Convention goes as far as to say that if you don't give a prisoner of war his tobacco ration, you are violating the laws of war. So that is how comprehensive the Third and the Fourth Geneva Conventions in particular, which apply to civilians, are in protecting people in times of war. And I find them very inspirational documents because states came together after the horrors of World War II and said, this is how I will treat your civilians, this is how I will treat your servicemen, and this is how you have to treat mine. The fact that, and I put this largely down to asymmetric warfare, you have an armed group which is not a state, which is facing off against one of the most technologically advanced states in the world, which has a genocidal intent against the armed group. And where we are today, I'm just thankful that Pakistan has a strong military and we have nuclear weapons. And so we don't have that same asymmetry of conflict that Hamas has compared to Israel that we would have against India.
You brought up the role of the permanent members of the Security Council. And I think that has been, in the case of Gaza, one of the main hindrance in getting any effective relief, because the United States especially uses its veto power each time in favor of Israel. In terms of the future and making amends, how do you think that we should deal with this imbalance and the power that has been given to the permanent members of the Security Council?
Well, I think that what has to happen is a complete reformation of the Security Council and the powers that it has under the UN Charter. So we've seen a complete paralysis in many situations where the P5 members, and this is baked into the system, right? So when people argue about the difference between law and politics, when it comes to international law, the politics is baked into it in the form of the P5. Why are those states on there? Because they were the victors of World War II. Like, why is France on there? Why is Russia? Why is the UK, the US? And then you have a role for China too. So either we see a geographical expansion of that P5, or we see that power now vests in the General Assembly. And when we look at it in the case of Israel-Palestine, it is so stark, the difference between the global north and the global south. And I think that the fact that we've had two advisory opinions, one is now currently being heard by the ICJ on the Palestine case, just shows how much the international community is against the actions of Israel and how much it is being supported by just a handful of very powerful states. Again, we did see this though in apartheid South Africa. We saw that apartheid South Africa was supported by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. And we saw the same kind of advisory opinions coming out of that situation. And they are just a piece of paper, but they're quite important pieces of paper in the way in which they galvanize the support of the international community to eventually bring about a change, to eventually bring about the South Africa withdrawing from Namibia and also ending its apartheid regime. So we can only hope that international law plays that same role in this conflict. And I think that the way in which the international community has gone against Israel and the way in which more and more states now are coming out saying that they're going to recognize the Palestinian state, something that they should have done long ago, even though I don't think that Palestine is currently a state, it is one way, a step closer to us getting to the point when it will be.
And you earlier also spoke about how you think both Palestine and Kashmir should be on the UN agenda, and the similarities in certain respects between the two disputes in terms of the right to self-determination. And also now a lot is being spoken about between the similarities between Zionism and the Hindutva project, which is currently underway in India. And there's been a lot of work by academics, by journalists, and by authors. And there's one particular book, Hostile Homelands, where they trace the similarities, the ideological similarities between between Zionism and the Hindutva project in India, and in particular about not just the foundation, but also practically what's happening in India, how the Citizenship Amendment Act mirrors Israel's right to return law, how the abrogation of Article 370, again, the violating their territory and imposing your own people on them and altering the demographic and the persecution of minorities in India. So it's a majoritarian project that is currently underway. And even recently, if you see the way that the BJP politicians are talking about it, they're talking about a greater India. And that expansionist rhetoric is similar rhetoric to what the Zionists also adopt. So the similarities between Zionism and India under Modi currently, it's very, very dangerous. And India and Israel seem to have found this new alliance. So how do you look at that?
Well, it's very interesting because it's so completely different from the India of the 1950s and the 1960s, because then they were still guided by the spirit of Nehru in that they were very anti-colonial, they were very pro-Palestinian. Fine, they recognized Israel in 1950, but that was just begrudgingly, as it was a matter of fact already. They also recognized the PLO as a legitimate representation of the Palestinian people. Cut then from then the 1950s, 1960s to 2016, when you saw Modi and Netanyahu build this nausea-inducing bromance where they would be taking strolls barefoot on the beach together in Israel, and then Modi framed that and put that in his office. I mean, very vomit-inducing. But that link between Hindutva fascist ideology and the Israeli Zionist ideology is so similar. The seeds of that they're very braided together in the sense of who is the other and who is not. And you're right, you can completely see that in the Citizenship Amendment Act of who we want to have as a citizen and who we want to give refuge to, and in the Jewish Law of Return from 1950, which is that this is the homeland for the Jews, not for anybody else. And I think you also see that in the sense of how they're going about the settler colonial mentality, in the sense of how they're going about changing what languages can be spoken in the territory, the moving in the settlers. It is very much that settler colonial ideology, which they're borrowing from the Israeli playbook. And even here, the wording used by one of the UT ministers was that we're not going to let one drop of water go to Pakistan, which, I mean, you can just exchange Pakistan for Palestine, and you can see that. And on a level between the two countries as well, we saw that there were protests in London outside the Pakistani High Commission. And the Telegraph just reported that Indian protesters were carrying Israeli flags and Pakistani protesters were carrying Palestinian flags. And I think that just shows how much Pakistan feels towards the Palestinian cause and how much India feels like they are the Israelis in this situation. And actually, that's who they want to be. So the founder of the Hindutva regime was like, if the Zionists get their way, we'll be very happy. And it seems to be that going forward rather than the Nehru India, which we'll see in the 1950s, 1960s.
And just one last thing I want to ask you, just in the context of the recent tension between Pakistan and India, is that, at least in my view, the response by Pakistan so far has been proportionate, and it has largely just been in response to these unjustified, unsubstantiated attacks by India. And on the legal front, we've heard from government members in Pakistan that they're considering invoking the dispute resolution mechanism under the Indus Water Treaty. How that actually plays out, considering India has held that it's holding that in abeyance, we'll see. There's been a breach of the Vienna Convention, so maybe a dispute resolution process alleging breach of the Vienna Convention. So Pakistan is exploring various legal options in response as well. What, in your view, is the most effective legal response and that Pakistan should adopt right now in the international forums?
So I think in terms of international forums, it should go towards the international forums which are under the Indus Waters Treaty. So what you've already mentioned in terms of the Court of Arbitration, India is not actually a party to the VCLT. So we're looking at what there counts as custom, and especially in terms of the language they've used, they've not actually referred to the VCLT, but they've referred to its language in terms of the fundamental change in circumstances. But I think right now, the legal response will probably take a little bit of a backseat to the military response if we do have a military incursion by India. And it seems like we might from what is being reported, particularly in the New York Times, it seems like India wants to give a bigger response compared to 2019. So all of those legal options are on the table. They're all being weighed up and measured by Pakistan right now. Of course, Pakistan has always maintained a very peacemaking and proportionate response to India's baseless accusations. But in terms of the military operation, Pakistan has also let it be known that we will respond to those as well. Of course, in line with international law.
Thank you so much, Ayesha, for your time. I take your point entirely, I think, about how we, in the media, when we talk about mostly the failure of international law. And I think, as you rightly pointed out, that in 2019, when there were tensions, we did see how international law did play its role. So there is clearly a lot to be said. So thank you so much for your time.